Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a quiet, stone-walled convent somewhere in medieval Europe. The candles flicker softly. The air smells faintly of yeast, fresh herbs, and something rich bubbling in an iron kettle. You might think monasteries and convents were all solemn prayers and dusty manuscripts, but tonight you'll find yourself in the brewery room, where the nuns aren't just praying, they're brewing beer. Now, fair warning, you probably wouldn't survive a single week in medieval convent life. The food's bland, the hours are long, and frankly, the sanitation leaves a lot to be desired. But the beer, that part's not so bad, especially when you consider that medieval water wasn't exactly crystal clear mountain spring quality. Brewing beer actually made the water safer to drink. So next time someone tries to convince you that their juice cleanse is healthy, just remember, medieval nuns were basically on a permanent beer cleanse. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, post your location and the local time in the comments. I love seeing where everyone's tuning in from now. Dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge through the cloistered halls in soft sandals. Your linen robe brushes quietly against cold stone. Outside, the garden herbs sway gently in the breeze. But here inside the convent brewery, it's warm. The fire under the copper kettle pops and crackles. Sister Maria stands nearby, stirring the mash with a wooden paddle longer than she is tall. Her sleeves are rolled up, and her face glows pink from the steam. You might be surprised to find out that brewing was an essential part of convent life, alongside prayer, copying texts, and feeding the poor. Nuns were expected to manage food production, and that meant brewing beer. After all, beer was considered a liquid bread, a nourishing part of daily meals. It was loaded with calories, vitamins from the yeast, and most importantly, it killed off harmful bacteria that lurked in medieval drinking water. Think of it as the medieval version of kombucha, except a little foamier and with fewer influencers. The basic recipe wasn't so different from modern beer: water, malted barley, and yeast. But here's where it gets interesting. Medieval convents often used herbs instead of hops, creating what's called brewed beer. The nuns added things like sweet, gale, yarrow, and rosemary, not just for flavor, but also for medicinal benefits. Imagine sipping a pint that tastes faintly of sage and lavender, while also supposedly curing your digestive issues. It's beer, and an over-the-counter remedy in one mug. Historians still argue whether the convents or the monasteries were first to refine these recipes. Some say the monks had the upper hand in brewing techniques, while others point out that nuns were often responsible for running the guest houses, which meant serving visitors, so brewing high-quality beer wasn't just a hobby, it was hospitality. Sister Beatrix, another nun in your imagined brewery, carefully weighs out crushed juniper berries. She drops them into the bubbling wort with the same reverence she uses to place candles on the altar. This isn't just beer, it's an act of devotion. In fact, many nuns believed brewing was spiritually cleansing. The rhythm of stirring, the patience of fermentation, it all aligned with their daily prayers. Plus, the brewing process gave them an excuse to gather together and chat, away from the stricter confines of silence in the chapel. Think of it like a medieval book club, but with less gossip about romance novels and more discussion of yeast strains. Now here's where it gets quirky. Some convents brewed multiple kinds of beer: light table beer for daily drinking, and stronger batches for feast days or special visitors. Imagine brewing a beer so weak it was basically medieval LaCroix. The flavor was just a hint of hops, barely there, but still safer than water. For high-ranking guests, though, the nuns pulled out the good stuff: thick, dark ales with more bite. And yes, before you ask, brewing beer was totally sanctioned by the church. As long as the profits went toward feeding the poor or maintaining the convent, the nuns could sell their beer in the local markets. In some towns, the best beer wasn't found at the monastery, it came straight from the convent gates. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen the Egyptians used? Well, brewing nuns had their own quirky remedies too. Some of their beers included calming herbs like chamomile and lemon balm, intended to help with relaxation and sleep. Medieval melatonin, if you will. There's even a legend about Hildegard of Bingen, a famous 12th century nun who recommended hops for beer because she believed it helped prevent spoilage. Historians still argue whether she actually invented hopped beer or just popularized it, but either way, she left her mark on brewing history. Without her, your modern IPA might taste very different, have more mold in it as you lean against the cool stone wall. The scent of fermenting barley wraps around you like a warm blanket. The nuns hum softly, stirring the mash in practiced circles. You can almost hear the bubbles forming in the barrels stored in the cellar below, quietly, turning grain into comfort. Outside, the church bell tolls for vespers, but inside this cozy brewery, the work continues. Brewing, after all, is a sacred rhythm all its own. The next morning, you wake early, because medieval convents didn't exactly do slimpins. The bells ring before sunrise, and like clockwork, the nuns begin their routines. But before prayers and chores, there's beer to check. You shuffle down to the cool storage cellar, feet padding softly over worn stone steps. The barrels sit quietly, lined up like soldiers, each one filled with a batch at a different stage of fermentation. Sister Agnes taps the side of a cask, listening for the hollow sound that tells her the yeast is doing its work. She draws out a wooden plug, sniffs the contents, and nods with satisfaction. The nuns know their beer not because they're secretly partying in the cloister, but because quality control matters. In the medieval world, brewing mistakes weren't just embarrassing, they could make people sick. Or worse, imagine hosting a bishop for supper and accidentally giving him a stomachache. Not exactly the fast track to sainthood. Now, brewing beer wasn't the only skill these nuns had up their wide sleeves. They kept detailed recipe books, too carefully written out in Latin or early German dialects. These weren't just instructions. They were part prayer, part science. Some manuscripts even survive today, complete with notes in the margins. One reads something like, "Add more honey next time, Sister Margaret says it tastes better." Imagine that centuries before Yelp reviews. You had medieval nuns leaving tasting notes for future batches. Historians still argue whether these brewing notes were strictly for the convent's use, or if they shared them with neighboring monasteries and towns. Some believe the nuns kept their best recipes secret, passed down from sister to sister like precious heirlooms. Others suggest they were more communal, happy to teach the craft to anyone willing to learn. Either way, their recipes traveled sometimes across villages, sometimes across borders. At this point, you're probably wondering, how strong was this beer? Well, it varied. Most convent brews were relatively mild by today's standards. Think 2% to 4% alcohol because the beer wasn't meant to get you tipsy. It was daily nourishment, a way to stay hydrated without risking disease from unsafe wells. But for festivals or feast days, the nuns brewed the heavier stuff, rich and malty, reserved for moments of celebration. Picture a group of medieval nuns toasting with wooden mugs after a particularly long Lent. Not exactly the image most people have of convent life, but it happened. And yes, the nuns drank the beer themselves. They weren't just making it for travelers or the poor. Beer was part of their own meals, sometimes sipped alongside simple stews or fresh bread from the convent oven. Remember, this was before refrigeration, and dairy products could spoil quickly. Beer, however, kept well if stored properly, and frankly, it tasted better than stale water from a communal jug. There's also a fringe theory, whispered about in some corners of academic circles, that brewing was therapeutic for the nuns. Think about it. Long hours of labor, chants echoing in the chapel, strict routines. Brewing gave them a tactile, creative outlet. They could adjust flavors, experiment with herbs, and just for a moment step out of the rigid confines of monastic life. Historians still argue whether brewing was purely a duty or a kind of quiet rebellion. Maybe it was both. You follow Sister Beatrix again as she heads to the herb garden, clipping sprigs of wild thyme and elderflower. These aren't just for medicinal teas, they're flavoring for the next batch of beer. Some convents even grew their own barley, maintaining small fields just outside the cloister walls. It was a closed-loop system, long before farm-to-table became trendy. If a convent had enough land, they might have a malt house too, where they sprouted and dried grains in low, smoky kilns. Imagine the scent of roasting barley drifting through the cloister courtyard, another layer of the convent's daily rhythm. Of course, brewing wasn't without its risks. Fires were a constant danger. Brewing required open flames and large quantities of boiling liquid, so accidental burns were part of the job. Some convent records include prayers for safety during brewing days. One even mentions a particularly clumsy nun sister Anselma who once dropped an entire vat of wort on the floor. She survived, but the beer did not. A medieval tragedy. Back in the cellar, you run your hand along the cool barrels. The air smells slightly sour, but not unpleasant. It's the scent of fermentation, of life quietly bubbling away. The nuns keep watch over it all, adjusting the brew as needed, transferring batches to clay jugs or wooden pitchers. Sometimes they'd even seal small portions in waxed leather bladders, an early version of the take-home growler. Over time, some convent breweries gained reputations that reached far beyond their stone walls. In a few cases, pilgrims would visit not just for spiritual healing, but for a pint of the nuns' famous brew. There are even records of bishops placing special orders, requesting casks to be delivered to their manors. You can almost picture the scene: a donkey cart rumbling down a dirt road, clay jugs sloshing softly in the back, all courtesy of the sisters. And just like today, brewing had its paperwork. The convent had to keep careful records of how much grain they used, how much beer they produced, and how much they sold. This wasn't just bookkeeping, it was essential for survival. Selling beer brought an income to fund the convent's hospital, school, and alms for the poor. Some scholars believe that without brewing, many convents would have struggled to stay open. So here you are, standing in the cool shadows of a medieval brewery, surrounded by nuns who balance prayer with pints. The fires flicker, the barrels rest quietly, and the herb garden waits outside, ready for the next batch. It's not the history you usually hear, but somehow it feels realer, closer, and a little bit comforting, like the soft hum of nuns at work, blending devotion with fermentation, one careful stir at a time. Now you let your breath settle into a slow, easy rhythm. Imagine the warmth of the convent brewery fading into a gentle hush, like steam dissolving into the air after the fire goes out. The nuns finish their work quietly, their sandals soft against the stone, their voices low murmurs of prayer and conversation. You picture the barrels resting peacefully in the cellar, the faint bubbles rising and popping in the dark, like tiny echoes of the day's labor. Outside, the herb garden sways under the moonlight, sprigs of mint and rosemary brushing softly in the breeze. There's no rush anymore, no clatter of pots, no lifting heavy wooden paddles, just the calm of a place that's done its work for the day, where everything has settled into a rhythm as steady as your breathing. Your eyelids grow heavier. The soft scent of yeast and herbs lingers in the air, but it drifts farther away now, like a memory folding into sleep, into rest.